41. Housekeeping. Domestic labor before 1660. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at how in the world the 17th century housewife in the British North Atlantic colonies before 1660 managed to make dairy products, bread, beer, pickles, roast and smoked meat, grind samp, draw water, tend a garden, dress fowl, all the food things really, on top of sewing clothes, making soap, doing laundry, and making time for devotion. How in the wide world was that possible? To find out, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know was that no woman was able to do all that alone. Usually she was not expected to. And before you get any crazy ideas, no, men were not pitching in. For anything having to do with food, once it was harvested from the field, farmyard, or forest, was completely women's work, and women usually helped with the harvesting. Instead, our colonial women were helped by other women, by girls, and on occasion by a few small boys. The how and why this help arrived is a messy, tangled, mixed bag of poorly conceived solutions, good intentions, profiteering, and the very best in religious chauvinism. For a few people, this turned out better than their wildest dreams, but for the vast majority of the people who were pressed into service, things did not go well. And the way things didn't go well were wide and varied. So the British were kind of jerks to my show timeline for putting a major change in how domestic labor was provided to the colonies in 1660. But I'm going to work with it. So this episode, 41, is about pre-1660 domestic labor, and the next one, 42, will cover the post-1660 world, up to the end of the century. These will also be those episodes where I'm not just leaving in the icky bits of history, I'm focusing on them explicitly. Because when we leave the icky, uncomfortable bits out, we get the same results as when we leave wastewater management out of our city planning. You keep finding yourself wandering around in icky, unpleasant things up to your ankles, or worse. You're not sure how they got there, and you feel helpless about finding a way to fix the problem because you don't even know what caused it in the first place. I'm finding myself in deeper and murkier waters than I ever expected myself to be in when I came up with this plan to do this podcast. But I'm not stopping this trip just because it's gotten more interesting. So in my bid to help reduce the number of unprofitable dead ends we take when trying to improve the lives of people doing domestic and food service for a living, and let's face it, everybody's job along the way, let's dive into what the domestic labor situation was before 1660 in the 17th century colonies and how it got that way. I'm sure it's no surprise to you that we are going to start out back over in England. But don't worry, I'm only going to wind the clock back to the Tudors, because that's where a bunch of changes happen. Back in the 14th and 15th century, there had been the bad waves of the plague that we call the Black Death. Then Henry VIII started busting up all the Catholic monasteries in the 1530s. He raided them for, among other things, their lands, their lead, and their eel rents. He also rearranged the iron trade by investing in blast furnaces, which planted the seeds for the military engine that would start England on its expansionist age that only really came to a halt in the 20th century. One feature of this series of societal shakeups was that long-standing, extended families that had been tied to Roman church lands were broken up. As a result of the scrambling of so many family and village arrangements, the city of London would experience explosive growth. The whole thing about Dick Whittington and his cat, Puss in Boots, heading off to the big city to make their fortune and become Lord Mayor of London was the fairy tale it was, because that's what so many people in the country were doing. In 1500, the population of London was around 75,000. It would approximately double every 50 years. In 1550, it was around 120,000. By 1600, it had reached around 200,000, and by 1700, it had reached somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000. These are rough figures, but will only get me disapproving scowls at conferences, not start slap fights. Before Henry's shakeup of the church land and laws governing town, village, and peasant rights put people on the move, families had had long-standing relationships with church and noble landlords. Extended families had multi-generational ties to a place, and much of the domestic household labor tied to the growing and processing of food was done by family of closer or more distant ties. Yes, there were the runaways, orphans, prisoners, and so on, but the last century had been largely domestically peaceful. The 100 Years' War had been mainly fought on French soil. And most people were mainly engaged in rebuilding family and reclaiming productive land from the neglect brought by the wash of the Black Death. The stability had enabled farmers to build more structures, establish markets and trade, learn Morris dancing, and build windmills. The breaking up of the Roman Church organized lands, the rearrangement of the lands, the reshuffling of movable wealth, the rise of new professions, and the seeds of the Industrial Revolution changed the domestic labor scene. The Black Death had interrupted families once and made the layers of family shallower. Henry VIII's Reformation caused irreparable breaks. Now it became even more common for people to work with and for people with which they had no familial relationship at all. Reading through the late Tudor history on domestic work made me see something I had never thought about before. In England, by the 17th century, just about everybody was either somebody's servant or they owned or employed servants. The line could get a bit fuzzy at times. Extended families and families working with and for each other still existed, but the shakeups of the old systems meant that there were more loose people wandering about, and employing someone who wasn't from around here for like the last 5 generations became much more common. Now at this time, being a servant at some point in your life did not automatically disqualify you from having your own servants later in your life. In fact, for a huge chunk of the population, it was an essential step on the ladder to adulthood and competency. When I speak of being a domestic servant, that includes brew house helpers, dairymaids, kitchen assistants, wool carters, spinsters, the typically unmarried women who produced thread, baker's assistants, or even just assistant housekeeper to a prosperous housewife. All of these lower-level positions were typically held by girls who had reached adolescence and had basic skills learned at home. As long as you were of reasonable family, it was pretty common to be fostered out and to go work in a workshop or a manor house or a larger estate. They would learn a wide variety of tasks, how a domestic establishment runs, and would often master a particular skill like weaving, garment construction, baking, brewing, butter and cheese making, and so on. Things like making remedies, pickles, keeping a kitchen garden, and child rearing would often be in the mix, as would manners, church devotions, and the current courtship rituals. Basically, the skills to run their own home, as well as a money-making skill, were the point of going out as a servant while young. Upon gaining age and skill, it was not unusual for young people to pair off, or really to be paired off by their managing parents, and either support the family enterprise or start their own offshoot with both the help of the elder generations of the family and servants they had hired on their own. The families in a village or town that employed the servants were working alongside them, on their land or in their small industry, or might be a smaller noble who was the landholder. While these children wouldn't necessarily go out as servants, they would work in the home or on their own manor, gaining the same skills. There could also be fosterage here, but that would often have a political element. But I'm sticking to the experience of the people below any level of nobility, so really the majority of people. And the important thing to understand here is that no single unit of a nuclear family could manage all the domestic tasks needed for well-being and comfort without the labor inputs of servants. There were definitely people who were on even lower rungs of the servant ladder who would never be allowed to leave, set up their own establishments, and employ servants of their own. There's plenty of older English law that discusses whether the children of female peasants and servants are also born into the servile state regardless of who the father is, and that will reappear in force after 1660. Laundresses, large swaths of semi-itinerant agricultural and building labor, assistants to more skilled servants, and all the people I've mentioned above, the prisoners and orphans and the like, who did not have the sort of family connections that would allow them to move up in the world. They would typically remain servants their entire lives. They were the most vulnerable and, as we shall see, soon the most likely to find themselves in the New World. But not as the brave, self-sufficient colonists carving out either a utopia on a foundation of faith or an agricultural empire on the principles of hard work. Instead, they were the largely disposable, mostly anonymous, generally despised, somewhat pitied, but mostly reviled human filth that was there to do the grunt work. These were the majority of the people who would be the indentured servants in the colonies. Before I get any further, I want to explain that before 1660, there was some, but extremely limited, race-based chattel slavery in the colonies that would be future America. These were mainly men and some women of both African and Native American descent. Prior to 1660, most villages, hamlets, and towns may have had customs around servants and slaves, but most of them did not yet have written slave codes. Many of the earlier writs lacked a mention of race, and even if they did call out non-Englishness, it tended to be aimed at Native Americans or were concerned with the religion rather than the race of the individual. Were they a Christian or not? Before 1660 and the rise of the slave codes, Native American and African slaves were far outnumbered by the indentured servants imported from Europe, and their labor was mainly used for tobacco or used as a currency to be traded for goods from the Caribbean along with fish, wood, salt beef, and pickled pork rather than in food production or domestic service. For this first housekeeping section, I am also choosing to focus almost entirely on the indentured servant system because they were far and away the majority of domestic and food production help before 1660, both on the continent and in the Caribbean. At this point, I'm sure you're wondering, what the heck happened in 1660? Spill it already. That is the year England officially enters the business of merchandising human beings from Africa as labor in the New World. For the rest of the 17th century, almost all of these people will be transported to the Caribbean. So it's not until the 18th century that the indentured servant is largely displaced, and I'll discuss that next. But to understand the why and how of that, it's important to me to spend time on how it all got started. For the indentured servant system, even before the creation of the Royal African Company, acted as a test bed and proving ground for the human labor exploitation systems that would be scaled up to drive the 250-year run of race-regulated chattel slavery that powered the growth of this country at least up to the doorstep of the 20th century. As with everything else, I want to unwind the thread and look at its start so we can understand how we created our current situation. The English Civil Wars end. Oliver Cromwell is buried and dead. Ding dong, buried and dead. And after that, as for the Stuarts, that early ignominious beheading was in the past. So the Stuarts returned triumphantly and possibly with a little chip on their shoulder to the throne of Great Britain. In 1660, the newly reinstated Charles II and his family, along with the City of London, formed the Royal African Company to start cashing in on the wild bonanza in African trade that the Portuguese had developed in the previous century. While they were after gold and spices, they were also there to transport West Africans as labor to the growing English sugar plantations they had started in the Caribbean in the 1620s. They also supplied the Dutch and the Portuguese plantations in Brazil, as well as anyone else who was buying, including the French. Of the hundreds and thousands and then millions of Africans who were shipped to Barbados, the main entrepot for English captains in the 17th century, only 1,000 or so were then transshipped each year, along with other mixed cargo, up the coast to the colonies before 1700. These mostly male slaves went mainly to the tobacco fields and Virginia estates. Further up the coast, some became novelties, curiosities, and displays of power alongside sugar, chocolate, spices, porcelain, and silk from the Far East, and colorful clothes in the larger colonial seaports and river towns. Very few were involved in the growing, processing, or cooking of food. Instead, during this earliest colonial period, that fell to the tens of thousands of debtors, vagrants, prisoners, delinquent and kidnapped children, loose women, discharged soldiers, and general troublemakers swept up from the streets of London and from the troublesome populations of Ireland and Scotland as the English fought to make England into Great Britain, or, in Dickens' memorable phrase of the 19th century, the surplus population. So how did this get going? As I hope I have made howlingly clear, doing all the things one needed to do to be a gentleman adventurer or utopia creator was a ton of work. So from the very beginning, on Roanoke, the failed colony, in Jamestown, and in Plymouth, every single one of these trips brought not just colonists and adventurers, but also passengers listed explicitly as servants. Some had contracts of the biblical 7-ish years, but others, mainly women, were tacitly expected to remain in the servile state. But these servants, as with pretty much every single one that followed them, had little say in enforcing this time limit. And since they were not paid, they were often fined extra time on their contracts for time off for illness, for injury, and in the case of women, pregnancy and child rearing, even when the women were caring for a household's children along with their own. That aside, indentured servants were also fined time for infractions such as laziness, theft, including the breakage or spoilage of food through improper storage or burning it while cooking, blasphemous acts, flirting, drunkenness, and so on. The list was as long as the contract holder had the will to make it. That said, some masters understood that happy, healthy servants were less trouble and did better work. But many did not. There was an incredible labor shortage in the New World. This is what led to things like free wandering cows and pigs, and the lack of soap, new clothes, and bread ovens in the early days. It also led to raids on villages of Native Americans, where after the adults were killed or chased off, the children would be brought back to the colonists' houses to be raised as civilized. They would work as servants in the house or fields, be taught English and proper Christian ways. This had only limited success as a strategy for labor recruitment, as many of these children pined and became sick and weakly, or ran away even after years of captivity, civilizing influences. And even when they did stay, they were almost never allowed to become full members of the community on account of their original taint of savagery. And this practice, begun right from the start in the 17th century, of using hard labor and family separation to, quote, take the Indian out of the child, unquote, it would continue under the cape of Christian charity all the way into the 20th century. But back in London, Parliament looked at the city, busting wide open with population. Impending food shortages threatened, and lots of people were at loose ends, adults and children, due to the Enclosures Acts and other land disruptions. In an attempt to tidy the streets and restore order, the City of London started arresting people and cramming them in prisons, which then caused a whole new set of problems. But the opening of the New World suddenly presented a novel solution. Along with being a source for raw materials, it was a somewhere that could be used for sending people away. That's right. Before we were telling ourselves that pets had just gone away to a nice farm upstate, the English government was telling itself the same thing about their pesky prisoners. Also, this is the start of the American tradition that continues to this very day of using prisoner labor to produce food. Yes, to today, whatever day it is, still going on. As a result, over the next 150 years, between 1/2 and 2/3 of all quote-unquote colonists would actually take the journey to the New World as an indentured servant. Why did it stop after just 150 years? Mainly because 1776 happened and London lost access to the New World as a dumping ground. Now, I hope they realized that this wasn't a sustainable policy and made some sensible choices back in Britain, and just didn't resort to shipping prisoners somewhere even further away than America. Of those colonists arriving through indenture in North America, a fair number of them were unaccompanied minors. During the 17th century, about half of those who arrived in this condition died within a year of their arrival. Due to this high rate of mortality, colonial planters started paying agents back in Great Britain, called spirits, to find them more. The prisons across England were largely emptied. Vagrants were lured into taverns and placed on ships. Children idling on the streets, orphans or not, were swept up to join them. There's even a pretty plausible story of a young baronial heir being kidnapped so his uncle could get the land. Like real Treasure Island stuff here. These kidnappees and those who had more or less voluntarily sold their labor were all placed in the low holds of ships and rarely or never granted air. They were indifferently stowed and sometimes escaped and caused trouble by getting into cargo in ship stores. When the Royal African Company began their shipments about 50 years later, they took note of these problems. Thus, they copied the specially devised holds and invested in iron shackles the same way other slaving nations had in the past, to better regulate the movements of their human cargo from Africa. But let's get back to before 1660 and our indentured servants. Upon arrival, the contracts of these servants were purchased by labor-hungry colonists. As a system, there were two inherent problems baked into indentured servitude as practiced in the British colonies, when viewed as a cheap and ready labor force. The first was that legally, theoretically, the servants did have an end to their contracts. Of the half that survived that first year, some did live long enough to complete their contracts and become free persons. They worked for pay, and some set up farms and businesses, married, and started up their own families. While land was initially promised and sometimes was actually granted, this was only true in the first few decades. Afterwards, the completion of an indenture was usually paid off with clothing, food, and sometimes cash. Local law was pretty good at enforcing this, and they didn't want newly freed persons to become a charge on the municipality. They wanted productive citizens. Newly productive citizens aside, the death and the retiring of obligations meant the obligate labor pool kept emptying. Servitude was ultimately not heritable. Minor children of servants were required to work for their master, but upon attaining their majority, they were free persons. They automatically aged out of their parents' servitude, even those with the very longest obligations. The second was that these were Christians. They too were children of your own God, even if they were criminals or possibly even worse, Catholics. Not everyone was worried by this, just as many weren't worried by the terms of some contract that had been signed by some people somewhere. But enough people were that the most flagrant and repeated abuses of the servants, legal and physical, were frowned upon and sometimes actually punished. And there was the ever-present worry of eternal damnation. So no matter how lazy or disobedient or drunken or prone to running away these servants were, there was a line that society called too far. Masters who crossed it could be shunned, run out of town, or dispossessed. Though this didn't happen often, it could and did, and as a result worked somewhat as a deterrent for the most egregious abuses. Between the Herculean amount of work and the government-subsidized shipments of servants, just about every colonial household, no matter how small, had at least one domestic servant. And since this is a podcast about food, and at this point the sphere of influence of women, this is where I'm focusing. She, whether a child or a grown woman, was expected to aid in all the repetitive tasks of food preparation and household maintenance that were required. Looking after chickens, hauling water, doing laundry, scrubbing pots and beer barrels with sand, removing the scum from brewing vinegar, pickle crocks, and checking stored pumpkin and apples for rot, attending to hung and pickled meat to make sure it was still sound, and tending and changing fires. Much of the grunt work that went on under, around, before, and after the more typical actions of food preparation. In larger establishments, these women might get to concentrate on one area just as their opposite number in England had, say, in the dairy or the bakery, but with villages so small and nearly every early colonial household just hanging on, this was unbelievably rare in the 17th century. So nearly every indentured servant was a jack of all trades, thrown into all sorts of trades they had never or barely known back in the old world. All the domestic ones, as well as pig keeping, cattle herding, grain farming, harvesting trees and wood products, dairying, tobacco growing, milling, frankly, everything. Which led to one of those bad news, good news situations. The bad news was that the most knowledgeable and skilled members of all these trades did not come to the New World. They had secure positions and, as I have said, had no interest in taking a flyer on this preposterous New World gamble. Also, as people with a place, they would not get swept up in the clearing out of the surplus population. So much of the efficiency and deep knowledge of the Old World did not travel to the New World. People were faking it, having to make things up as they went along, or get help from the locals, like the Squanto thing with the building hills for corn and letting fish bits rot in there for fertilizer. The result was a bunch of bad years, where lots of people died of not having enough food, and the poor placement of wells relative to latrines and the incursion of seawater at high tide. The good news was that new and rediscovered technology that was absolutely bursting out of Europe was greeted with enthusiasm. The rediscovery of knowledge from antiquity, through the rise in interest in alchemy, travel abroad, literacy, and then the printing press, and I might suggest the arrival of caffeine and tobacco to supplement or partially replace alcohol, helped spread the old knowledge and new developments all around. In most of England and Europe, much of this new knowledge was met with a lot of, and I mean a huge helping of, well, we need to be cautious here, and I'm not sure if this is a good idea as it will upset the old ways that have served us for so long. And a perennial favorite, but think of the disruption this will cause to the social systems and how it will affect the children. In the New World, where people were starving, and there was a higher concentration of people who were there because sure, they'd take a chance or, I don't know, #YOLO, lots of the new technology was tried out. This became more evident in the 18th century and beyond, but the attitude was already there in the 17th century. The indentured servant situation meant that just about everyone in the New World was low-skilled at most things they did. In the highly skilled and tightly coordinated work world of the late medieval and early modern periods of Old England and young Great Britain, everyone respectable more or less had a station and a place. The colonist, on the other hand, had to kind of do everything and figure it out as they went. Sometimes it made a mess, and sometimes it made something stunning that did more work faster and would set a new standard for the world. The blueprint for the American was to be pretty good at lots of things. The phrase, jack of all trades, went from an insult, or jack of all trades, master of none, to a badge of honor. The old mold of being the very best at one thing and depending on experts in their field for everything else was left behind. This certainly applied to men's work, the outdoor sphere of things like woodworking, hunting, grain farming and milling, fishing, blacksmithing, raising sugar and tobacco, and so on. And it also applied to women's work. There was no longer a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, a dairy, a public house, a fishmonger, a draper, an apothecary, and so on. All of these things returned to the home. The crafts and trades became de-skilled and noticeably rustic, and would stay that way relative to England and the rest of Europe for quite a while. until well into the 19th century, if you wanted sophistication, the best food, the best clothes, the best theater, and the best conversation, head to Mexico City. America was a rustic backwater. I mean, we had federal anti-theater laws on the books until 1789. Can you believe it? So as not to make this an hour-plus long episode, I've broken it in half. Head to part 2, the economics and what went down after 1660 in episode 42. That's a pretty heavy episode too. But next week, March 9th, is the end of the season question show. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. I know it can seem like it doesn't do much, but taking the time to give this podcast a rating on your podcast widget of choice makes it even more visible to a wider audience. So even if you don't have the time to write a whole review, if you've gotten this far, please drop it and leave me a couple of stars. 5 would be nice. And along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consume for this episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio @THOA Food and in the show description.